I was hearing all these reports from my informants that people were being murdered, they were being forced to convert, they're fleeing the country in droves. And I had to ask myself, why is it this community, which is so small, they're pacifists, they are largely vegetarian or pescatarian, they don't eat red meat, they don't eat pork, their names are indistinguishable from other Iraqi names. You couldn't pick one out of the street if you wanted to, generally, except for the priests who are very distinguished by their clothing. So the question is, where did this bloodlust come from? There were, I think, between 30 and 35 families in Fallujah at the outbreak of the war, and almost within the first week of it, a group of people from the town approached the Mandaean families and said, okay, the time of you people existing amongst our midst is at an end. You know, it's time to either convert to Islam or die. And one older gentleman said, this is ridiculous. We're your neighbors. Where is this coming from? We had no idea. And they killed him on the spot. So the men were circumcised and the women were married off, the unmarried women were married off as brides, the Sunni men. But whenever we find a group that answers the descriptions of the Mandaeans today, and in some cases they're actually explicitly identified as such, those are identified as legitimate Sabians. But at some point, Islamic scholarship took a detour, and I think this is as a consequence of its encounter with Western scholarship.
Welcome to Independent Thought and Freedom. The 21st century's American interventions in the Middle East has caused a level of destruction in the entire region that we barely even understand. That's largely because we, on this side of the world especially, barely understood the Middle East in the first place. Its history, its peoples, its diversity, its layers upon layers of civilization, with remnants of each era still surviving and living side by side, even if not always comfortably. One tragic story is that of the Mandaeans, or Nazoreans as they call themselves. The Mandaeans are an ethno-religious people native to the alluvial plains of southern Mesopotamia or Iraq. They are followers of Mandaeism and consider themselves followers of John the Baptist rather than Jesus. They were probably the first to practice baptism and are most commonly understood to be the last surviving Gnostics from antiquity. In the aftermath of the Iraq War of 2003, the Mandaean community of Iraq, which used to number about 60 to 70,000 persons, collapsed. Fewer than 5 to 10,000 apparently remain there. That's the estimate. The other community of Iranian Mandaeans have also been dwindling as a result of religious persecution over that decade. Today, we'll be speaking to Dr. Charles Haberl, one of the world's specialists on the Mandaeans, to understand their plight and to get a better understanding of the world of the Middle East in general through their experience. Dr. Haberl is currently at Rutgers University and the author of The Neo-Mandaic Dialect of Khorramshahr. I hope I pronounced that right. Welcome, Charles.
Thank you very much.
Right, it's a pleasure to have you here. Right, so you recently got back from a trip to the region. Is that correct?
Yeah, I was actually doing some field work with a different ethnic group on the border with Syria, Turkey, and Iraq. If you look at the map and you see the panhandle of Syria, if you travel about 45 minutes to an hour north of there where the three countries come together, that's where I was. And there are a smattering of villages in that region, in the mountains of Kurdistan, that still speak Aramaic to this day in situ. So I was very interested in meeting the people there and working with them and doing some work on their language as well.
Right. So you're primarily a linguist or a historical linguist?
I admire linguists for their scientificity and for their rigorous thinking and thought process. I also consider myself a historian of religions, but the academic study of history and the academic study of religions can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Whereas I think the linguists have elaborated over the last 2 centuries a sort of plan of attack on the study of languages that most people can agree upon. I'd like to believe. I mean, there are, of course, major theoretical differences between the different schools of linguists, but we can use one another's data.
Right, right. Now, Yeah, I mean, you brought this up, and I'll go off on a little sidetrack here, but because I think you'd be able to provide some good insight. Philology, right? Nietzsche was a philologist, wasn't he?
That's right.
And that seems kind of perhaps closer to what you're doing, maybe, but the discipline kind of fell away. Could you
Yeah.
maybe provide some insight?
Well, it's interesting. A lot of famous thinkers and great minds have been philologists or philologians. Nietzsche was one. Of course, Tolkien was another. Um, Basically, anytime that you are studying the phenomenon of language through texts, you are in fact a philologist. And because I work on historical and comparative linguistics, mostly through texts, but also through direct observation in the field, and I also work on the scriptures of different religious communities, that makes me a philologist as well. And there are still philologists. It's sort of fallen out of fashion in recent decades. I think largely as a result of the work of two men and the schools that they produced. One, of course, being Noam Chomsky, who shifted the focus of experimental linguistics to um, child language acquisition and neurological development of language and instantiations of language, which is all very, very important. Don't get me wrong. I don't think that this is a wrong turn for the field to make, but it necessarily took our attention away from texts and things like historical linguistics. On the other hand, Edward Said, whose work I also admire very much, lambasted the philologians for their work in the service of empire. As you probably are aware, many of the philological discoveries, particularly in the study of Indo-European linguistics, in terms of studying Vedic Sanskrit and the Avesta, all came out of this sort of colonial encounter of the British and French in South Asia. And that was precisely what he was critiquing, and critiquing philologists such as myself, and the degree to which we're unaware of how much what we do is impacted and structured by empire.
Yeah,
So
that's
people just sort of don't do it.
sorry.
So people nowadays, when people study literature or they study languages, they shy away from doing philological work precisely because they're concerned about the sort of critiques that Edward Said leveled against his predecessors.
Right, right. Yes, yeah. And those are two huge names you brought, Chomsky and Said. And although Chomsky's linguistics has nothing to do with imperialism or anti-imperialism, certainly his political work is that's basically what it's
Yes.
founded upon. So that's very interesting, because when you talk about the languages of the Middle East, in which you are, I understand that's your specialty, that area. I mean, you inevitably, get caught up in empire and the whole history of it, and not just Western Empire at all, but the whole history of Middle Eastern empires, which is fascinating. And in fact, to kind of counter Edward Said's Orientalism, by studying those other types of imperialism, you sort of deprivilege Western imperialism in a certain sense, and you understand power historically, which was not all one-sided. Would you
No,
agree?
not at all.
Yeah, yeah. Now, could you to get onto the Mandaeans, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right, as with an English accent, of course. But how did you get involved in studying them?
Well, that's an interesting question, and it sort of ties into the reason why I do the sort of work that I do, and it's a bit of a long one. So as a child growing up in the U.S., like a lot of other children, when I became, I'd say maybe around 10 or so, I developed an interest in the occult, which I think a lot of parents would find disconcerting. My mother was a school teacher, and consequently, in order to sort of channel this interest into a more healthy vein, she purchased for me a copy of the British Museum catalog of amulets and other magical objects. And so I read through this thing page to page. I still own it. It's on my bookshelf. And that's where I first encountered these people. They had in this catalog a series of terracotta bowls, which were inscribed in spirals around the inside of the bowl and sometimes on the outside as well, or perhaps sometimes spokes like a wagon, a series of incantations, mainly for either resisting magic spells or trapping demons. And this was, I read this right about the same time that Ghostbusters came out in the US, in which they had these containment devices that would trap demons as well. And my mind naturally made the connection between these Mesopotamian incantation bowls that the Mandaeans used to make and the device from Ghostbusters, and I was trapped myself. I didn't think much of it until my college career, when I started studying archaeology, because this is the sort of thing that led me into being interested in material culture from the ancient world. And my instructor at the time was an Egypto-Semitist who didn't have a lot of regard for archaeology, but he really liked languages because archaeology is inherently destructive. You can only dig a site once. Once you've conducted the excavation, you can't repeat it because everything's been taken out. So everyone who comes afterward is dependent upon your data, or more properly, your interpretation of the data, and they aren't able to reproduce what you've done to see whether you were right or wrong. And that's been a perennial concern in the field of archaeology. Whereas with linguistics, and particularly the sort of linguistics that I do, people can go to the same villages that I've gone to, they can interview the same people that I've interviewed, and they can come to their own conclusions with this raw data. And for that reason, I took a detour away from archaeology and material culture into the study of language, and particularly the historical and the comparative study of language. And it was not until my graduate experience, as a grad student, I went to Harvard, and the very year that I arrived, a group of professors there decided to organize the first ever international conference or congress on this community, the Mandaeans. And as a kind of grad student flunky, they tasked me with kind of hewing wood and carrying water. So among the things I had to do was go to the mayor's office. At that time, it was Mayor Tom Menino, and get him to change the name of the River Charles to the Jordan for the day by mayoral proclamation, because we were going to hold a series of baptisms on there. And I had to get the permits to organize the baptism. I had to make sure that they were able to have a small fire altar there for the baptism, and many other things. And this is going to be the very first baptism that occurred on North American soil, or North American waters, as it were. So this extended even so far as to finding proper lodgings for the priests whom we were bringing from Iran, because they needed to be close to running water. A priest cannot drink tap water or bottled water. They have to drink water directly from the source at all times, and they have to use it for all of their ablutions and for preparing food.
So can I ask you the year? Yeah. Because you mentioned they were Iranian Mandaeans, which were, and I know in 2002, I believe, the Mandaeans were declared by the U.S. government as a special refugee, a special group. Yeah. Was it around the same time? Was that consequent upon this?
This is actually a few years before. This is 1998, 1999 that I was doing this. The main reason we use the Iranians is because than they are now as a reformer, and of course Saddam Hussein in the U.S. Of course there was no love lost between those two, so it made more sense to bring people from Iran, believe it or not, than from Iraq. Right. And of course the Iranians also uniquely still speak their language. The communities in Iraq had shifted from Mandaic, which is a form of Aramaic, to Arabic some point 100 years ago. No one is exactly sure when, but even the oldest subjects that I work with, who were born in the 1920s and the 1930s, recall their parents and their grandparents speaking Arabic in the home.
Right, right.
So they've been speaking Arabic for a very long time in Iraq. In Iran, they still speak Aramaic. So when the priests came, I had to find them lodgings, and members from the community here, there was a small community at that point, came out to make sure I was doing everything right, because they didn't necessarily trust me. And they were very happy with all the preparations I made for this Congress or this conference. And as a consequence, because they were also participating in it as well, they wanted to take part in the baptism because they had not had this opportunity in the US. They came from Canada to visit. They came from California, and they were so happy that they invited me into their homes to do work with them. And that was the genesis of my own doctoral research, was making these personal connections with a community in Boston as a consequence of this conference.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's very interesting. So let me so can you give us an idea of the community and its history? It's fascinating. I mean, when we first spoke about it, and you were talking about there being affiliated, if you want to put it that way, to John the Baptist rather than Jesus. All the sort of debates of the early church and the different gospels and all that history sort of came to mind, and it's just so interesting. I'd like you to elaborate on that.
Well, it's actually, this is the crux that people have discussed about them over the last 100 years or so, and I think it's the genesis of their downfall as well. There are a bunch of contradictions here. One of them is the fact that they call themselves Nazareans, yet they don't seem to have, which is a word associated in the Christian West with Jesus of Nazareth, but they don't seem to have very high regard for Jesus at all. Instead, they follow John the Baptist, who was not, as far as anyone knows, from Nazareth, and nor did they say he was. So that's question number one. Why do they call themselves Nazarenes? The other thing is they're known as Sabians, which is a bit of a problematic term as well. The Sabians are mentioned as one of four licit peoples of the book, legitimate peoples of the book in the Quran, which is to say that there are Muslims, there are Jews, there are Christians, there are Sabians, and these people follow legitimate, respected religions with an identified prophet and an inspired scripture. The only problem is the fact that they're called Sabians has caused them to be confused with another group, the Sabians of Haran, which is today in Turkey, not far from where I was just last month, who allegedly worship the stars and the planets. And so people accuse them of being star worshippers, which under an Islamic religious system, categorization, is absolutely the worst possible thing you could possibly be. This is idolatry. So I saw this firsthand when I was doing my field work in 2003. Suddenly, I was hearing all these reports from my informants that people were being murdered, they're being forced to convert, they're fleeing the country in droves. And I had to ask myself, why is it this community, which is so small, they're pacifists, they are largely vegetarian or pescatarian, they don't eat red meat, they don't eat pork, their names are indistinguishable from other Iraqi names. You couldn't pick one out of the street if you wanted to, generally, except for the priests, who are very distinguished by their clothing. So the question is, where did this bloodlust come from? And that question has actually occupied a lot of my research in the last few years, certainly since 2003, with the beginning of the American invasion that kind of opened the Pandora's box on all this bizarre hatred for this community. So the question I have, and as a historian of religion as well as a linguist, that I have to ask myself is, what is it about their history that leads to this sort of confusion? And the only answer I have is it's scholarship. It's the work of Islamic scholars from the various earliest years, the Islamic era, after the advent of Islam, and the work of Orientalists, also somewhat like myself, exactly the same ones that Edward Said lambasted, who have done this whole community a very grave disservice by kind of muddying the waters and saying, no, they're neither Nazarenes nor are they Sabians, despite the fact that in 2003, they were, and they still are, the only group in the Middle East that claims these titles for themselves.
Right.
That's the mystery.
Yeah. I mean, and you make an interesting point in one of the papers you wrote, that just as contemporary Greeks will refer to Plato and even Alexander the Macedonian or whatever as Greek, and as scholars will know that it's not a neat line back, but they're granted the the liberty to make that connection, but the Mandaeans or Sabians are not. That I think that's an important point make, and I guess that does go into Said's critique of, Orientalism and whatnot, using different standards, and I suppose not looking at our own cultures with the same critical lens as we might be looking at others. But I want to just clarify something you were talking about, the bloodlust. Now, is that on account of the Mandaeans being confused with the Turkish community, who are seen as star worshippers, or is that from something, or is that bloodlust from something else?
I think it's probably overdetermined. I think there are multiple factors. There are several reasons. Number one, many of the common folk are jewelers. After the Jews were expelled from Iraq in what was called the Farhud, it's kind of like an Iraqi pogrom, many Mandaeans moved from the south of the country into Baghdad and kind of occupied their niche as jewelers and jewelry makers and smiths, blacksmiths of all types. And as a consequence, even though no one in Iraq was really very wealthy except for Saddam Hussein and his family, they were perceived as having this hidden wealth, right? They're jewelers, they're smart, they must be keeping gold in their shop somewhere where no one can see it. So that's number one, the economic motive for attacking them, is that they are perceived as being wealthy. And this is a stigma that's also been brought against Jews in the past as well. Another problem is that, like many minorities in the Middle East, they were among the most assimilated and westernly oriented groups in the Middle East. They wore business suits. Many of them became doctors and lawyers and engineers. One of them became the second president of Baghdad University. He was a famous scientist. He had attended MIT in the 1930s and graduated with a PhD in only 2 years in theoretical physics, which I can't tell you how impressive that is to me as someone who took 6 years to get my own PhD. He must have been really quite accomplished, and he was a scholar who corresponded with Einstein, really the best and the brightest. And as a consequence, Karim Qasim, who was at that point the ruler of Iraq, made him president of Baghdad University, despite the fact that he was not a Muslim. But you can see how this might lead to some sort of envy and also resentment that if you were a traditionalist and you feel that the problem with your country is that all these people are kind of assimilating to the West and adopting Western modes, then perhaps this community, which is among the most assimilated, is the cause of this problem. So the assimilation to the West is another problem as well, in addition to the economic motives. And I think also, as we are well aware, the American invasion in 2003 shed a light on many divisions within Iraqi society, economic divisions, religious divisions, sectarian divisions. And that really came to the fore after the kind of authoritarian power that Saddam Hussein and his regime represented was removed, right? We didn't have anything in place to take care of that. So people immediately, Sunnis and Shia, started attacking one another. And the consequence and the casualties of this were all of these religious communities and this great sectarian and religious diversity in the country. Many of those people just simply fled.
When you speak about this story, I'm thinking of Syria and Bashar al-Assad and the Alawites and the Yazidis. There are so many of these communities in the Middle East that so many people in the West are totally unaware of, and many times these so-called these authoritarian leaders, let's just say that they are authoritarian, but they also protect the minorities from a lot of the Salafists and the sort of puritanical, violently puritanical, particularly Sunni sects that that seek to purge all heresy violently. Was there a similar relationship between the Mandaeans and Saddam Hussein, like say how the Alawites or Yazidis, the Christians, feel this, that Bashar al-Assad is their protector? Was there something like that?
Well, the Mandaeans are kind of like any sort of upwardly mobile, very accomplished community. composed of doctors and lawyers and engineers. They have no shortage of leaders and no shortage of differences of opinions. And this is actually, from what I've noticed, a feature, if I can essentialize for a moment, a feature of Iraqi society in general. It's kind of like the saying, you know, if you have two people that have three opinions among themselves. So I've noticed that Mandaeans have espoused both Ba'athist politics, if we can say that, as well as extreme left. So like many Iraqi communists in the past were Mandaeans from the very start of the party. Malik Saif, who was second in hand to Comrade Fahd in the Iraqi Communist Party at its inception, was a Mandaean. And they continue to be so up until recently. I mean, as you're probably aware, the communists are part of the ruling, the governing coalition in the Iraqi parliament right now. Together with the Sadrists, they formed a bloc. And so they kind of espouse both sides, both pro-Saddam and anti-Saddam, like anyone else in Iraq was for a while. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a feature kind of the fact that they were urban, they were educated, they were to some extent elites in many respects.
Right, right. So, you know, I'm again trying to, you know, follow your research and about the bloodlust and their ethnic cleansing, because would you say? I mean, was it, you know, kind of like with the rise of ISIS and that Salafism, or, you know, because from what you're saying, I didn't actually get that impression. I assumed it was that, but from what you're saying, it sounds like it may have been something simmering, perhaps both theologically, but also, you know, politically, in terms of, you know, they're being sort of seen as the tip of the spear for Westernization or something. Yeah. So could you clarify that, elaborate that a bit for me?
The problem with the Mandaean problem, as it were, in Iraq is not a creature of either the Sunni or the Shia. In fact, while some of the earliest instances that I collected were in traditional Sunni areas like Fallujah, for example, there were, I think, between 30 and 35 families in Fallujah at the outbreak of the war, and almost within the first week of it, a group of people from the town approached the Mandaean families and said, okay, the time of you people existing amongst our midst is at an end. You know, it's time to either convert to Islam or die. And one older gentleman said, this is ridiculous. We're your neighbors. Where is this coming from? We had no idea. And they killed him on the spot. So the men were circumcised, and the women were married off. The unmarried women were married off as brides, the Sunni men. But very quickly after that incident, fatwas were issued by Shi'i religious leaders as well, including Al-Hakim, several members of the Al-Hakim family, who were, as you are aware, those people who are running the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq, the Skiri party, that we, the Americans, brought out of Iran at the time to kind of govern Iraq. And so as soon as they settled down, they started saying, you know, the status of this community is not so clear. We should consider them dirty. And, you know, in Iraq, this idea of being najis or dirty has a lot of power. If you are religiously impure, if you're dirty, then I can't eat the same food as you do. And I can't visit your house because I'll become impure. I certainly can't marry any of your children. In fact, I have to contain myself or segregate myself from you as much as possible. So this is more a feature of, I would say, of the Shia in Iraq, but it really came to bear in a big way as effectively state-sponsored segregation against these communities. And you can see why even the ones who were not directly targeted for violence wanted to get out, because who wants to live in this sort of Jim Crow type society?
Yeah, and so the this council of what was it called? The Islamic Scholars or Islamic Council? What was it?
Well, the party, the political party that was started was originally the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq, and that changed its name, I think, in 2008 or 2010 for the, now I'm forgetting what it's called, the Islamic ISKI, I think the acronym was, but so they
Okay.
rearranged the name around a bit. They got rid of the word revolution simply because they thought that revolution at that point meant revolution against Saddam Hussein. And
Right.
now that basically they had gotten everything they wanted, they no longer needed to be revolutionary. They just needed to be
Right.
Islamic. They, by the way, no longer have the sort of power they used to under Iraq. Things have changed.
Because I was, so they did not recognize the Mandaeans as the Sabians from the Quran. Okay. Right. But the Mandaeans in Iraq claimed to be those Sabians mentioned in the Quran. Is that
They
correct?
are, as far as I know, the only group in the Middle East that identifies themselves as such. And so
Right.
all of their associations are known Sabian Mandaean Association. They make a big point of identifying themselves, and near as I can tell, for the last 1,000 years or more, Islamic scholars have been very comfortable applying this term to them. Now, there are those who have said there are these other ones in Haran, in what is
Yeah.
today Turkey, and they worship the planets, and they're not real. But whenever we find a group that answers to the descriptions of the Mandaeans today, and in some cases they're actually explicitly identified as such, those are identified as legitimate Sabians. But at some point, Islamic scholarship took a detour, and I think this is as a consequence of its encounter with Western scholarship. Um, when I looked into the Western scholars who have written about this subject, many of them felt, many of them were, first of all, Christian apologists, right? Um, they were threatened by the idea of a community that identified itself as Nazarene but didn't love Jesus Christ, and that claimed to have a sort of inside line to John the Baptist that Christians didn't have. And so they, in a way that is not at all scientific, set about to kind of prove that they were not legitimate from the start.
Ah, that's
And
from what, like
everyone
the
kind of wrote
18th or
favorite
19th
candidates.
century?
This started in the 19th century. There was a
19th.
Yeah, there was a there. Well, so the scholarship on the Mandaeans started already in the 18th century or even earlier, but I think really the genesis of this sort of animus, Christian and Muslim animus against them, really is found in the scholarship of the 19th century, and that's largely as a result of Christian apologism. Um, they set about kind of trying to create an alternate narrative for who these people might be, and they said, well, if they aren't who they claim to be, they're actually ancient Mesopotamian polytheists, worshippers of the stars and the planets. And that was a line that was then clearly picked up by Islamic scholars. First by those who are secular, like Abdurrazak al-Hassani, who was a famous Iraqi historian in the middle of the 20th century. He was the first to write not one but 3 editions of a book on the Sabian community in which he kind of repeated uncritically these Western claims about them. And that was subsequently picked up by the Islamic scholars, who they would never admit to this, but they are actually following scholarship that is not Islamic scholarship, right? Their own scholarship on Islam is, believe it or not, informed by the works of people outside of Islam. And that's something that they'll deny, but we know that they have an audience, either directly, as in the case of them studying at Western universities and reading Western works on Islam, or indirectly, as it was through this one Shi'i scholar, Abdurrazak al-Hassani, who wrote a book in Arabic, but he cites a lot of Western authorities in this book. And that was kind of the pipeline into what we saw after 2003.
That's very interesting because it reminds me of so many other incidents where, you know, things like deconstruction or critical, you know, these types of critical theories. And in the West, you know, they're kind of like intellectual games.
Yeah.
Whereas in other places of the world, they're matters of life and death.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Even Leo Strauss used to talk about philosophy in the ancient world was a matter of life and death, and that's why you had the esoteric and exoteric in his model of interpretation. Whereas today, you know, people debate it openly, and it's just ideas, but it's not just ideas in places like this. That's
No,
fascinating.
we have to be very careful about what we think and we say. And I'm not saying this in a sort of PC sort of, oh, I have to police my speech and whatnot, although perhaps there is an element of that as well. I just think that we have to stop for a second and ask ourselves, is what we're saying make sense, or is it in the service of another agenda? For example, Christian apologism, right? Am I saying this about the Mandaeans because I don't think what they're saying has any basis to it in reality, or am I saying it because my religion and my belief system is personally threatened by what they have to say about themselves? And I need to separate those two. And also, we have to be careful when we're talking about doing ethnography and field work with the living community that, well, there's a professor at Chicago whose work I very much admire, Stefan Palmier, and he wrote in one of his more recent books about Afro-Caribbean religion that the study of these things is an interface between what the informants want to tell us about themselves and what we as scholars want to learn about them, right? We cannot pretend that we're doing pure science here and that these facts just sort of exist out in reality unmediated by any agendas, right? Both my informants and I as a researcher have our own agendas that come to bear on the way we present our data. That may be one reason why I feel a little more comfortable presenting myself as a linguist, because the agendas are not so clear when I'm reporting linguistic data, even though I guarantee you they exist. When you're writing about history of religion, then it becomes much more obvious that there's some sort of agenda there. And I will say that my colleagues who follow my linguistic stuff, they have very few complaints about it. They say, this is wonderful. This is new data. We're looking forward to using this. But when they read my history of religion stuff, they recognize there's an agenda there, which I'm actually quite explicit about. And that is kind of rewriting or readdressing some of the agendas that have gone into what we claim to know about this community up till now, to kind of sort of address some of the harmful effects of scholarship in the past.
Yeah, because it seems to me, from what you're telling me, that taking their claims seriously and honoring their claims might have saved many lives, thousands of
Yes.
lives. I mean, if you respected their idea that they were Sabian, just like modern Greeks are Greek, like Plato
Yeah.
or Aristotle, that would have really saved many thousands of lives in an entire community, in fact.
Yeah.
That's a tragic story, really, when you think about it.
And also, I
Yeah,
found
sure.
when studying this community, they have lots of interesting things to say about their own past and about the past of people around them, which we don't get if we just sort of discard everything we're saying. If we say we don't believe a word they're having to say about us, about Mesopotamia, about Christians, about Jews, it's all nonsense, then we lose out on possibly having some new perceptions or new understandings of our own history. And I'm speaking about us in a more broad way. And I think that would be a real shame. I don't think we can afford to throw them out. Even if we disagree with my model of their history, their own model of their history, the Islamic model of their history, even if we disagree with all these things, I still feel, as you said at the very beginning when you started talking, that they represent a kind of unique perspective on the history of the region that you can't find anywhere else. They're one of these many small vestiges of a past that is now largely gone. And I would like to actually cherish this instead of trying to attack it.
Absolutely, and it's really weird because I suspect a lot of the scholarship, perceives themselves to be taking up the mantle of Edward Said, when in fact they would be doing the exact same thing Said criticized, which is imposing their view and disregarding the view of those who are being studied, and it has this the same distance of those with the knowledge and those who are the subjects. And I like, you mentioned Afro-Caribbean, and I'd like to mention an experience of myself, because I'm in the Caribbean, but from a Hindu community here, and it will tie into something that you wrote about the Mandaeans, which spoke to me. So there are two threads here that I can pull it together with, which is that you were talking about your own impression was that this community was a kind of vestige of a time before the categories of Jews, Christians, Muslims, etc. had come into being. So when things were a little bit more fluid, boundaries had not been set, and so forth. I recently came across a book, a study of the Trinidad Hindu community, and I'm a Hindu from Trinidad. I'm also I was a trained anthropologist as well, in the 4 branches, which is unusual because usually now it's just social and cultural, or biological is separate. And and this person was arguing how Hinduism didn't really become something in Trinidad until the 1920s, and that in the 19th century, when the indentured laborers first came across, it was far more fluid. There wasn't anything defined specifically as Hindu, and so it's interesting. But I also recognize, as being a scholar, in the Western tradition, that it's pure postmodernism, it's pure social constructionism, it's pure Foucault, and they have this whole thing, about everything is a construction, nothing is real, and it's all power relations and X, Y, Z, and it does really have political effects here, because it will feed into a discourse of delegitimizing the community, and it's wrong. And so not only is that there's this ideological difference, it is historically wrong. I can say, for instance, in my family, I can go back to show how this is just, it's a total, this elaborate construction on a minute base of facts, because you are a visiting scholar that just comes here every now and again, and it's come from a time when the subjects could not speak back, right? When we were merely objects of investigation, and one of the amazing things I think about the Middle East in particular, and I suppose India, not necessarily the West Indies, but is that with the at certain points in history, the literate societies were those societies and not European societies, and so it really sort of upends everything. So I'd like you to elaborate on that, with tying it into my interest in your idea about a time when things were more fluid and etc. Understanding them from that historical perspective.
Yeah, well, 2 things really. Number one, when you look at this community, there's sort of a palimpsest. So a New Testament scholar sees in them the community of John the Baptist. Jewish scholars see in them the remnants of the diaspora that went to Babylon during the captivity. Iranian scholars see in them a kind of quasi-Zoroastrianism.
And I must say, just to interrupt you a little, from some of the things you were saying, I was even trying to think of some Aryan connections there myself. You're talking about the pacifism, the not eating meat, and the almost casteism that you were talking about. Yeah, there seems to be something there.
There's some, Mandaeans themselves, particularly educated ones, are well aware of the ties to Iranian and South Asian religion in particular. Some would say that the fact that the priests do not cut their hair at all, they actually wear it tied up in a turban. They wear all white, so they have a white turban, and they grow their beards and their hair out, and they don't eat meat, red meat. Some would see in this a connection to Sikhism, for example. But when you really scratch the surface, you come upon a sort of world, all these associations that exist. This wasn't cobbled together in the 19th century by Lady Helena Blavatsky as a sort of theosophical enterprise. This is real stuff, near as I can tell. It predates this sort of modern eclecticism. It's an ancient eclecticism, for sure. But I would also say, doing this sort of research on these small communities, not the hegemonic ones, not the ones at the top of the pyramid, but groups like the ones you mentioned before, the Yazidis, the Alawis, the Mandaeans, is subaltern historiography in the sense that was envisioned by people like Gayatri Spivak. It's a study of the world from the bottom up. And that is why I feel like the insights that we can gain from studying these communities now and in the past are actually extremely valuable to give us a different perspective on the history of these ancient literate societies, right? Which are so important to our understanding of ourselves, no matter where you're from. I mean, the Middle East contains within the seeds of basically a kind of global history, right? People have said that if you wanted to write a history of the world as a whole, the fulcrum on which you'd have to do it would have to be Iran, right? Because Iran was at the center of all these different
Yeah.
confluences in history, right? You could write a history exclusively from the perspective of Europe, but it would leave out most of humanity. You
Yeah.
could write a history exclusively from the perspective of East Asia, but again, it would leave out everything that was happening in Africa and in Europe. On the other hand, right in the middle there, Iran and South Asia, you have all these confluences of history, of peoples, of languages, of cultures, and that would allow you to write a truly global history. And I feel like this community is not the key to that global history, but it provides important data that we can't discount.
Absolutely. You know, I mean, even just doing a little bit of background reading, I'm by no means an expert into it, but just looking at there was mention made of other communities in Iraq. So one is Aramaeans, then Armenians. Well, everybody knows about Armenians. Yazidis have become famous. The Roma, I don't know if it's the same Roma they're talking about as in Europe. Okay, and Shabaks.
Yeah.
So what are the how would you place the Mandaeans within this universe of of groups, I suppose, historical groups, I suppose, like what time, ethnically, how do they fit in origin in terms of time zones, religiously, how do they fit in? If just to get an idea of the mosaic.
Yeah. I would say going purely off anecdotal data, right? I don't have the answer to that right now, and I may never have this. Even if I studied this material at the end of my days, I probably wouldn't have an answer. But going off anecdotal data, one of my informants once told me that he was working once with a Lebanese guy who was a member of the Druze community in Lebanon and in Syria and Israel as well, incidentally. And this is a community not unlike the Mandaeans as well. They tend to marry within themselves. They have a sort of priestly caste that does its own thing and dresses in a certain way. The question of how they're related to Islam and other religious communities is very unclear. So there's a lot in common there. And so naturally, my informant, my friend, asked them, his colleague, when you go back to the bled, when you go back home, I want you to ask someone, and in this case, it was going to be his uncle, who was one of the priestly caste, one of the uqal, the people who knew about their religion. I want you to ask him a couple of questions. You know, did you do this? Did you ever baptize? What sort of foods do you eat, and so on? Just for background information to see if possibly these two communities are related to one another. So his friend went back to Lebanon, and he asked his uncle, did you baptize? Why do you wear white? Why do you eat these things? And he said, who is asking you these questions? He says, well, I have a friend back home. He's Iraqi. He's a Mandaean. He's Sobbi. He's a Sabian. And the uncle, the knowledgeable priestly caste guy, said, this is what you need to tell your friend. Tell him his community and our community were once one. But when the Muslims came, we went into Islam, whereas you stayed out of it and became people of the book. Now, I don't know that this is true. This is a story being told in the 21st century, after all, about something that happened 15 centuries earlier. However, it does speak to their own self-representations and their own perception of their own shared history. And I do think that even if it's not as clear-cut as these two individuals would claim it was, that there is something to this about a kind of substrate, a religious, an ethnic, a linguistic substrate to the region that predates the arrival of Islam, and that informs to a certain extent what we see in the region today.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and I'm sure there are all these subterranean links and that we really have no idea about, and as you said, if we take these communities seriously and their stories and their literature, which is much longer than the literature of Europe and so forth,
Yes.
we can learn so much. And I think also tying it in with archaeological evidence and so forth, this is something almost totally different, but not really. The history of the world economy. I've been totally convinced by Andre Gunder Frank about the fact that the current world economy is actually 5,000 years old. Capitalism is nothing new, and that the very economy we are in now is continuous, and it started off in Egypt, Mohenjo-daro, Mesopotamia, and then it expanded out. And the way that they've been accumulating their evidence and data is also through just looking at material archaeology and the circulation of goods and so forth, and being able to piece these things together. And as you say, I mean, the modern scholarship is so shallow. It's based both ideologically and in terms of its the material in which it draws from. It's ignoring all these things you're talking about, which are even if we can't take it literally, because they might have gods or they might have strange creatures or whatever. But there's a lot of valuable information there that can be sorted out, and I think that's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, we can't simply just discard. We can't pick and choose as we want, at least without first considering what our own agendas are, what our own principles are for excluding or incorporating data. I mean, one thing I have to say about my scientist colleagues is that they are well aware of the human element in the kind of research they do. They take every step they can to minimize it, to control for it. And that's something that we as humanists and as social scientists struggle with doing. And sometimes we're more successful than other times. I'm not saying we throw the human element out entirely, but we have to be aware of it and we have to control for it, exactly as our colleagues in the hard empirical sciences do. And part of that means being greedy for as much data as we possibly can to get the fullest picture of our subjects as possible.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now, you said you study the literature of the Mandaeans, correct?
Yes.
And that would necessarily mean the religious texts and whatnot.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I just produced a translation with my colleague James McGrath of Butler University of one of their chief works in their language is called Drashidihya, or the Mandaean Book of John. And so what I've done is created a bilingual edition. On one hand, the text that I've controlled from about 11 manuscripts in the original language, and on the opposite page, English translation, and then a scholarly commentary after that. And so what I'm hoping to do with this is at least produce a new modern translation incorporating all the benefits that we've had over the last 100 years or so of scholarship on the languages and literatures of these people. And I'm presently working on another translation of one of the books in their one of their largest and principal scriptures, which is called the Genzarabo, or Great Treasure. And that is a different sort of text because it's a chronicle. It's a chronicle of historical events in the 4th and 5th and 6th centuries of the Common Era. And it's unique in this regard. I don't know of anything really like it from that same region, with the exception of perhaps the Edessa Chronicle, which is written in Syriac, a related language. And so I think it will contain a lot of data that's useful for historians who are interested in the situation in the Middle East at the advent of Islam and in the 100 to 200 years prior to that. What this region that Islam inherited from its predecessors was like prior to Islam, immediately before Islam, and in the direct aftermath of the Islamic conquest.
Right. So, and they wrote in the Mandaean language. Is that right?
Yes, it
Okay.
has its own unique script, and that language is not spoken by anyone else. It's related to other languages, including the language that I was working on in Turkey, distantly related to it, although you can really see the parallels between the two. But
Mhm.
it's a form of Aramaic, which people would say is the language of Jesus, and therefore that kind of bolsters some of their claims in a kind of broad sense to having an authentic and direct connection to that era, right? They speak an ancient language that is now largely disappeared from the surface of the globe. That bolsters their claim to having some degree of authenticity,
Yeah.
however we want to define that.
Just as an aside, is it the same Aramaic that Mel Gibson used in The Passion of the Christ?
Well, that's an interesting thing. Actually, I know the guy who translated that, Bill Fulco, who teaches in LA, and he he kind of concocted his own sort of Esperanto Aramaic from different sources. The basis of it was, as far as I know, biblical Aramaic, with a mixture of stuff from the Targums and whatnot. And I asked one of my informants who speaks Aramaic fluently, Mandaic, and he said I didn't understand nothing. He was just very dismissive of it. But then I spoke to a friend of mine from Nabatea, which is a city, a Shi'i city in the southern part of Lebanon, just over the border from Israel. And he said, it's amazing, Charles. I can understand 60% or more of the dialogue. So I don't know what to make of that. So he spoke Arabic as his native tongue, but obviously the Arabic that's spoken in Lebanon is heavily Aramaic inflected,
Right.
down to the grammar, and has a lot of words as well from Aramaic. So even though my informant who spoke this Eastern variety of Aramaic from Iran couldn't make heads or tails of it, this Arabic speaker from the same general area could, which I found was very interesting.
Yes. About the literature, and we're mentioning Jesus. So the Book of John you're talking about. I remember I was raised a Catholic. I used to be a Catholic. My mother's Hindu, my father's Catholic, so that's why I eventually went to Hinduism. I remember in religion class, we studied the Bible, and I remember the first time being told when I was, I maybe 14 or 13 or something, that there were other books besides the four, and they were actually rejected. There was a Gospel of St. Thomas, and
Yeah.
I was always curious, wow, why were they rejected? What stories did they have in them? And I remember I actually never ended up, I have to buy it and read it, but the Gospel of St. Thomas was telling me there's one thing where Jesus took up some mud and made a pigeon and made it fly, or another one where he struck down somebody dead, or I'm not sure.
Yeah.
So
They're weird stories. I mean, the
yeah.
Acts of Thomas, which is a book beloved of the community of Nasrani Christians, the only other community I know that identifies itself as Nazarene, so to speak,
Uh-huh.
in Kerala. These Acts
Yes.
of Thomas talk about this character named Thomas, who was one of the apostles. According to these Acts, he was actually not just an apostle, but Jesus's twin brother, which raises
Right.
all kinds of questions
Yes.
about Jesus' divinity, and this guy is his twin brother, therefore is he also God? I don't know. But the way he treats him is not particularly fraternal. Jesus tells Thomas, I need you to go to India and convert there are lots of people in India. I want them all to be Christian. Go to India. And Thomas says, I don't want to go to India. It's so far away. So Jesus knocks him out and sells him into slavery to the king of India. It's a very, very strange story.
Yeah.
And there's in it this lovely, in some versions, there's this lovely poem called the Hymn of the Pearl, which is also at the heart of so many Gnostic belief systems, about this person who goes into the world and he forgets his background and his ancestry. And it's not until a kind of an eagle comes as a messenger and reminds him of who he is. And it's a really lovely story. And it's something that, makes a lot of sense from the perspective of all of these traditions that find themselves kind of lost in the material world and trying to get back at the fundaments of their own religion. But yeah, I would say, although they are not Christian and they don't identify as Christian, and they don't even necessarily have a lot of regard for Jesus, that their book, the Book of John, could be classified in the same general category of these sort of lost gospels,
Right.
and lost books of Acts and lost hymns and whatnot. They are a kind of vestige of the literature, also of the Christian tradition, that was at one point much broader, much more diverse, and incorporating of a broader array of perspectives. That's sort of been kind of narrowed down through centuries of homogenization. And that, I think, is one reason why so many people are threatened by them.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't know if how much scholarship has moved on since the 1980s when I was taking those religion classes, but I remember they talked about a common source that I think Matthew and Mark had, maybe Luke, but John didn't use it, and they just called it Q. I don't know if they
Yes.
still right. And apparently I've heard other people talk, like in the Quran, Jesus is revered as a prophet and so forth, but they don't believe he died on the cross. But apparently there are other gospels that also had that, so that the Quran was actually also using other early Christian texts that were not included in the contemporary Bible and so forth. So
Absolutely. Yeah, this is the Gospel of Barnabas. But
yes.
there's a debate over whether that's pre-Islamic or post-Islamic. I mean, who knows?
Yeah.
I
Is the Gospel of John? You say it's in that family. Is it about John the Baptist, and does it go like with his beheading? Is it by one of his disciples, like maybe how John or Luke or something is? Or is that what is it about the life of John the Baptist? Because
well,
he's one of the
what
most
they call it.
charismatic persons in the whole Bible, and that tiny little few verses they have in the Bible, it's just so arresting, that personality of John. To know that there's a
Yeah,
whole book on it, I think is fascinating. I'd like to know more about it.
there's a lot going on in this book. The sections on John are the single largest chunk of that book, but they are by no means all of it, or even most of it. They're just the largest chunk. The first part of it is a kind of titanomachy. It's a story of a kind of a rebellion amongst various figures in the light world. They fight with one another as a kind of family feud. Then after John, after the section on John, there's this discussion of this woman named Mireille, who is apparently, according to the text, a convert who then became a kind of quasi-priest, which is interesting because nowadays you can neither convert to this religion nor can women be priests. But this character, this figure, Mireille, does both. And then after that, there's a lot of sections on sort of correct moral behavior and so on. It's a miscellany of different texts, but it does talk about John's life, obviously to a much greater degree than anything in the New Testament. And it also doesn't talk about his death, which is interesting.
Okay, that's interesting. So let me see. Yeah, I don't want to get too much into the theology, although that's fascinating to me. But you mentioned the world of light.
Yes.
It sounds how related is it to Manichaeism?
Well, this is a bone of discontent among various scholars. So Manichaeism is a historically, shall we say, chronologically structured religion. We think we know who the founder is a guy who is called Mani, and we think we know exactly when it came about, right? He had a revelation during the reign of Shapur, the king of Iran. So we can talk in very certain terms about the origin of this religion, in the same way we can talk about the origins of Christianity or of Islam. It's much more difficult to do that about other religions like Hinduism, like like Mandaeism, like Judaism as well, right? That you cannot point to a specific beginning point for these religions. So most people would say that Mandaeism represents the tradition from which Mani emerged, right? And we know from the Manichaean sources that, and the people who write about Manichaeans, that he grew up in a baptizing community in southern Iraq. They wore white, so on and so forth. It sounds very much like the people that I study. However, we also seem to know, as you started the program by saying, that the ancient world was much more diverse than it is today in certain ways. Modernity has had a homogenizing effect upon the region, religiously, culturally, linguistically. And so I would say we cannot jump to the conclusion that just because we have a community today that responds to these characteristics, and that this figure emerged out of such a community, that they are one and the same. And that is one thing that my colleagues are laboring to say. You cannot say that he was a Mandaean that created his own religion, right? There's very little evidence for that. The best we could say is that there was a ferment of baptizing, Aramaic-speaking, Gnostic religions in 3rd century Mesopotamia under Iranian rule that produced both of these communities today.
Yeah, and
although
I think
there's interesting thing to say
yeah.
about this. One of the same communities that has preserved for us a version of the Thomas legends that are also found in India is the Coptic community from Egypt. And we found manuscripts of the same legend, but in the Coptic language. Similarly, we also have manuscripts from Egypt, from Nag Hammadi and others, that preserve Manichaean texts that look very, very much like Coptic translations of Mandaean texts. Among them, the ones that I study in the Book of John, in the Great Treasure. So it seems that this community also used the same texts that the Mandaeans still use to this day, that the Mandaeans did at one point. And after a certain point, it gets to the question of the Greeks, right? Do we deny these communities the retrospective recognition of their own ancestors? So we have a community that practiced baptism, that lived in the marshes of southern Iraq, that wore white, that used many of the same texts that the Mandaeans use still to this day. Does it make sense to say, no, they're not the same thing at all? I don't think so. I wouldn't say that they are exactly the same thing. I think that 14 or 1500 years of, more than that actually, of evolution, of change, distinguishes that community from the community we have today. And that's one of the reasons why I'm interested in them, after all, is because they do exist today, that they have somehow survived in a very different environment. But I would also say that it's not quite enough to say there's no connection whatsoever behind these two communities, or that even, as some people have argued, that the Mandaeans arose out of the Manichaeans. I think that's putting the cart before the horse.
While in discussion and you're making these points, I came upon a contradiction that I'd like you to elaborate on, because I think that a lot of this appears to be coming from a kind of deconstructionist, postmodern influence type of scholarship.
Yes.
So where they want to deconstruct anything essential. Yet, on the other hand, and so as they deny the rights to claim a heritage or a lineage to the ancient past in these countries, on the other hand, in America, people who may have been there for one generation or two or even three cannot legitimately claim to be heirs of the founding fathers, right?
Yeah.
I mean, and so it's kind of like the opposite thing. Because they will not argue that. They would say that everybody, when you step foot, you can be an illegal immigrant or undocumented immigrant, and you can claim the heritage of the founding fathers. Yet,
absolutely, on their mantle.
Yes. So, could you elaborate on that?
And I don't mean to be too pomo here, but it's all about power. Who has the right to claim these things, right? The Greek can say, Herodotus and Homer and Aristotle and Alexander the Great, these were our ancestors and we claim them as our own. And they have a modern state, and they have quite a lot of cultural capital. They have a lot of soft power as well. If you look at any history of how Westerners conceive their own identity, Greeks take pride of place. And so even if they don't have a lot of military power, they still have a sort of soft power that they can bring to bear in making these claims. In a way that, for example, Turks, who also claim Homer and Herodotus, don't They're not allowed to do this, right? Homer and Herodotus technically lived in what is today the territory of the Turkish Republic. Yet if I were to tell you, well, Homer was an ancient Turk or Herodotus was an ancient Turk, I would be laughed out of any room outside, perhaps as Turkey, in which case
Yeah.
they'd say, yes, yes, that's true. So in America, someone who is first generation, a Marco Rubio, for example, can say, I am acting in accordance with the values of the founding fathers who are my intellectual forebears. And he'd be totally right, but he has the power to do that because he's part of our governing party. And, Americans, like any community, like to view their own history as being continuous, right? And honestly, there's no other way to do it.
Yeah.
It's when you get to a small, marginal, subaltern community like the Mandaeans, who have no real political power and who have no kind of cultural cachet, outside the fact that, of course, there are things about them that fascinate people like me, their Aramaic tongue, their intriguing religion. But outside of this small coterie of kind of geeks and freaks like myself, they don't really have a lot of cachet. They don't get to make these same claims of retrospective recognition. They do not get to claim, oh, our ancestors were these. They're prevented from doing so by the kind of self-appointed gatekeepers. And while as a scholar, it behooves me to be measured about what I claim to be their ancestry and what is not their ancestry. I don't want to, get ahead of myself and make claims that I can't justify later. I would also kind of draw apart the curtain on all these claims of the past about these gatekeepers and say, hold on a second. What right do you have to prevent these people from recognizing their own history in their very own texts?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And the contradiction is that the people that are denying one group but empowering another group are the
Yeah,
same people, and they're using the
yeah,
same argument. It really it's actually logically inconsistent. It's logically inconsistent. I guess as
yes.
a final reflection, I'd like you to bring to bear on this. It's within the realm of geopolitics. You have Russia involved, who also have their own sort of history, as being the Third Rome, the Orthodox Church. You have Turkey, you have Saudi Arabia, Saudi Arabia's weird role of the Wahhabism, and Mecca. It's kind of both ancient and modern in that sense. Of course, the U.S., which is, I hope, American viewers don't get offended, but with its very shallow understanding of history. How do you see these various actors who are all in the region right now? Do you see that their own histories and backgrounds and understandings affect the very act of intervention? Does it affect political policy?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that, so for example, Russia's influence in the region obviously continues a policy towards the region that began with the Tsars. The Tsar famously wanted for Cossacks to wash their boots in the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean. The Iran policy of Russia has remained remarkably stable for hundreds of years. And I would say that the Putin's policy right now in Syria also reflects this. I mean, Syria under Assad Sr. was a close ally of the Soviet Union, and they view it. Latakia has long been a port of call for Russian ships, and I think that he sees their collaboration in Syria very much in that vein as a historic one between two countries that were historically allies. Um, with America, I don't really know what our policy is in the Middle East because, first of all, it's not consistent from regime to regime. And the Iran deal shows exactly how clear that is, as is our dealings with the Kurds. And, we've had going back to Wilson, really, even before that, right? I would say even going back to Ismail Khedive in Egypt. Um, after the American Civil War, a lot of former Confederates ended up in Egypt doing things like cartography and teaching military lessons and whatnot. And so that, I think, is one of the earliest instantiations of American involvement in the region, is when we were supporting the Egyptians in their efforts to become independent from the Ottoman Empire. But yeah, we were involved with the Kurds under Wilson and the Armenians too, and that really didn't work out very well for either community. We have an interest in the region because of our interest in, obviously, in the oil resources and other natural resources of the region. I don't know that it's necessarily informed by our own sense of identity, with a possible exception of the most hypocritical aspect of this, which is we see ourselves as the kind of guardians of aspiring people yearning for autonomy, like the Kurds. And that certainly, I think part of that motivated our support for the Kurds in the northern part of Syria and in Iraq when we intervened in those countries. But under the Trump administration, of course, we've seen that reversed. So it's really hard to speak about American policy in the region from term to term of various presidents. George Bush did one thing, Obama did the exact opposite, particularly with respect to Iran, and then Trump reversed Obama. And I think a lot of people in the region are taking note and saying they're just not reliable. I mean, we cannot have more than a 4-year horizon with these people. The real rogue factor here is China, because China is deeply involved in the development of the Gulf. They're deeply involved in the development of Syria. At least they were up until the Civil War. I think that has made them a bit shy. They clearly perceive themselves as allies, not only of the Russians, but also the Iranians, at least on military issues, on issues of defense. But they do not have the same sort of support for example, Israel, that Russia and the US have shown in the past, right? They've shown themselves, I think, to be more of a neutral arbiter in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which drives so much drama in that region. So if you ask me what the region would look like in 10 years, as I think as the US, rightly or wrongly, withdraws from influencing that sphere and China becomes more and more involved, I could not say. At some point, I honestly think that they can look at that region more neutrally than Russia can. They can look at it from a more neutral perspective even than the US can. I don't know what that actually translates into in terms of their influence upon the region. But I will say that competing for influence in that region, formerly with the US and now with Russia, could potentially lead to some conflict in the future.
Right. Yeah, and just to tie that in to your own, personal story and your dissertation, you were mentioning how when you were studying there in the region in 2003, the invasion happened while you were there, and you said something about the Mandaeans being concentrated there under false pretenses. Could you just kind of go over that, and it sounds interesting.
Concentrated where?
Let me read what you put here. When I was working on my doctoral dissertation in 2003, the U.S. embarked upon an invasion of the country in which they were concentrated under false pretenses, and in the aftermath of the invasion, my subjects were ethnically cleansed.
Well, that's a good question. I wonder what I meant by that. So perhaps I meant they were persecuted under false pretenses.
Okay.
I think that, two things happened. Number one, many of the Mandaeans, as well as the Assyrian Christians and the Chaldean Christians and many other ethnic groups who are minorities, actually viewed the American invasion hopefully. They thought, well, this could be not only would this mean an end to Saddam Hussein, who's a thorn in everyone's side, but perhaps it means a chance to start anew, a blank slate, and maybe even the development of a new and democratic society. And that's, of course, not what they got. They got an Islamic Republic, and a very repressive one at the very beginning. But because many of them worked as interpreters, as translators, as guides, and as collaborators in a very real sense with the occupying American and coalition forces, they were persecuted. And I think a lot of people on both sides of the aisle here in the US, many good Republicans and many good Democrats, are aware of this inherent contradiction. These people put everything on the line to help us out when we were there, and they're being persecuted specifically because of their work with us to help us, and yet we're not willing to lift a finger to help them except for the middle one, right? So a number of people on both sides of the aisle have put forward bills to allow them to come to the US with asylum refugee status. That has never succeeded. In many cases, they were stuck there. Some have subsequently been able to flee to the US via Mexico if they had means. They traveled to Mexico, then showed up at the border and said, I'm claiming asylum status. And very often they've gained it. As a consequence of it, some of the largest communities in the US are growing in places like San Antonio and San Diego, places that are relatively close to the border. But there has never been a proper process by which Chaldeans, Assyrians, and Mandaeans have been able to enter the US in recognition of very real peril that we put them in after the invasion by enlisting their aid and support.
That's very interesting, because the 2002 act allowed the Iranian Mandaeans
Yes.
special, and then also just as a parallel, I mean, it reminds me so much of what's going on in India with the CAA Act, the Citizenship Amendment, where they're allowing Hindus and Jains and Buddhists from Bangladesh and Pakistan and Afghanistan to come in, and there's been so many protests about that. But it's very, very interesting. But this has been a fascinating discussion.
Thank you.
It's amazing to learn all these things, and I'm glad to talk to you. Being such a well-read expert on this. Do you have any plans or for your research or projects coming up in the future you want to talk about?
Yeah, my fingers in a bunch of different pots. I'm working on the aforementioned translation of the Book 18 of the Great Treasure, this historical chronicle about the region in the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries. They actually name names and give dates, which is very interesting. It's a secular sort of history, very different from what we're used to from the scriptures of this region. I am also writing a book on sort of scholarship and its discontents. Provisionally, I'm calling it The Fault in Our Stars, the stars being those people whom we put on a pedestal in terms of their scholarship in the past, but writing about how this ultimately led to the ethnic cleansing of the Mandaeans in southern Iraq. And then finally, I'm also writing a book called Flights of Fancy, in which I talk about folklore of persecution and subsequent migration, and how Mandaeans and other communities in this area have skillfully deployed these legends to kind of make sense of their contemporary situations. So they have a long and storied tradition of folklore about being persecuted and then fleeing to another place. And I think this is probably common for any small religious or ethnic community in that region. But I wanted to collect for the first time a bunch of these different legends from them about these sort of pseudo-exodus narratives or migrations, and talk about what it means to the community in contemporary times, how they make sense of their own situation using folklore.
Oh, that sounds fascinating. I really look forward to it, and wish you the best of luck.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Well, I want to thank you very much for this interview and your insight. I and my audience have certainly learned a lot. Thanks. Well, that's all for Independent Thought and Freedom this week. Please join us again next week. And in the meanwhile, make sure you subscribe, leave me a rating, and like and share this podcast with your friends. Thanks, and bye for now.